By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead. I have discovered that talk can come across immensely convincing. However, talk, as has been said, don't make it so. I discovered the dichotomy of that idea as an athlete. There were lots of guys in my youthful days who talked about being athletes and how much ability they possessed and how well they could perform. And then I stood witness as some of those athletic talkers tried out for various teams. However, it oftentimes happened that those big talkers soon fell by the wayside. Why? Simple. Their talk was eventually tested. And when it was tested, they were found to be false talkers. I was on the wrestling team in high school 4 consecutive years. Just before the season started, during my sophomore year, I received word that one of my classmates was coming out for the team and that he would be taking my place in the 190-pound weight class. Now, folks, I didn't weigh 190 pounds. In fact, I only weighed 165 pounds at the time, but that was the weight class where the coach put me in the lineup. My classmate, who had announced that he was going to be taking my spot, weighed every bit of 190 pounds, and he had been a dedicated weightlifter for numerous years, and in fact, he looked a lot like some of these weightlifting champions that you see on television. Well, of course, there I am, a skinny 165 pounds, stretched over a 6'1" frame. I was about that big around. My classmate and I had been friends for at least 2 years, but he wasn't going to let that stand in the way of wiping up the mat with me. Now, folks, I've got to tell you, when word came down, he was coming out, was going to take my spot, I was a little apprehensive about potential outcomes. Then the day came when my classmate actually made it to practice. The two of us got out on the mat and we wrestled. To my surprise, his 190-pound, muscle-bound body could hardly move, while my lanky 165 pounds sort of went through him like the Tasmanian devil. Well, it wasn't long before my athletic talking friend quit the wrestling team and went back to the weight room. He had some convincing athletic talk. He even scared me a little bit, but when his athletic talk was tested, he proved to be a false talker. Well, the same thing is true in the academic world. One of my sons, when he was 16 years of age, announced to me in the middle of the summer, "Dad, I'm going to make straight A's this year. When it's all said and done and May rolls around, I'm going to be on the honor roll." Now, I referred to him as a grade talker. Have you ever known or been in a conversation with a grade talker? Have you yourself had a child who was a grade talker, telling you how good he or she was going to do? The truth, however, is that words are much easier to come by than grades. Grade talking has this characteristic. Sooner or later, it is going to be tested. Sooner or later, grade talk is going to be proven as genuine or false. You know, in the same way, talking about faith is easy. Saying that you live by faith is not a difficult thing to do. Anybody can say they live by faith, and in fact, all across America today, there are those folks in churches just like this one, and those who were there claim to live by faith. However, faith talking, like any kind of talking, is cheap. You would probably agree with me when I say that talk means nothing until the talk is put to the test. The church at Corinth, located in the ancient world, was filled with men and women who were tremendous faith talkers. They could wax eloquent about their spiritual ability. They could go on and on about how devoted they were and how insightful they were and how together they had it in their relationship with the Lord. And yet Paul wasn't so sure. Listen to what he wrote in his first letter to the church at Corinth. He said, I will come to you soon, and I shall find out not the words of those who were arrogant, but their power. The word translated arrogant means to inflate, it means to blow up, it means to swell up, it means to puff up, it means to lift oneself to a lofty height. This word is the root word of bellows, B-E-L-L-O-W-S. In that verse, Paul communicated at least three words to the church at Corinth. Here's the first. Words in and of themselves are nothing but the circulation of hot air. And Paul had little concern for words. Here's the second thing Paul was saying. The key to dynamic living is power. That is the ability and the actuality of following through on one's words. Now, the ability to act is critical. But even more critical is doing something positive and constructive with that ability. Here's the third thing Paul was saying. Just as athletes are eventually tested, and just as students are eventually tested, so men and women who claim to live by faith are always eventually tested. Claiming to have moving, shaking faith is one thing, but sooner or later, the reality of that faith is going to be demonstrated. Sooner or later, some huge challenge is going to slam into your life. And when it does, everyone will discover whether faith talking has been nothing more than false talking. Now that brings us to Abraham, who plays the lead role in Hebrews 11, 17 through 19. So let's look at that again. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead. Now, Abraham's inclusion in the most famous chapter on faith is no accident. Neither is it an accident that we often refer to Abraham not only as the father of our faith, but as the father of faith, period. Now, here's why. He passed the test. In fact, Abraham ultimately passed such a huge test of faith dimensions that most of us simply cannot imagine putting ourselves in his place. But then that's what makes Abraham a faith walker, not a faith talker. And that's why he takes the headline in Hebrews 11, 17 through 19 as a supreme example of living by moving, shaking faith. He was tested, and he passed the test brilliantly. But what kind of test did Abraham pass? God asked him to give up his son, Isaac. However, it was not merely giving up his son Isaac like Hannah, who gave up her son Samuel to be raised by the priest Eli in the temple. It was actually offering his son as a sacrifice to God. That meant taking the life of his son, slaying his son, and then placing him on an altar of fire. Yet it was not merely taking his son's life and offering him as a sacrifice to God. It was taking the life of the son through whom all of God's promises to Abraham had been made. Do you remember the promise that God made to Abraham? God's promise to Abraham is first recorded in verses 1 and 2 of Genesis chapter 12. And this is what the Bible says. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation." God had promised that he would employ Abraham as the genesis of a great nation, a new people. Therefore, if Abraham was going to be the head or the beginning of a great nation, it is logical to assume that he would have to produce a son. Now, the problem with producing a son was that Abraham's wife, Sarah, was barren. She could not have children. So how in the world could Abraham become a great nation? Well, Abraham tries to figure this thing out. He had a difficult time coming to the place where he was a faith walker instead of merely a faith talker, but he tried to figure it out to help God keep his promise. It occurred to him that his manservant Eliezer would be his heir through which everything would pass. Well, that's when God spoke to Abraham again, this time in Genesis 15, beginning with verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward will be very great." Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house," that's Eliezer, "is my heir." Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." And he took him outside and said, "Now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said, "So shall your descendants be." Well, Abraham wasn't the only one trying to figure out how God could be helped to keep his promise. Abraham's barren wife, Sarah, was trying to figure it out too. And wouldn't you know it, she came up with the idea, a surefire plan to help God keep his promise. She offered to her husband Abraham her personal servant, Hagar. Abraham would then have his son through her. And Abraham says, "Oh yeah, Sarah, that's got to be it. That's how God is going to do this thing." Most of you know the story. Abraham had a son through Hagar. But that son, whose name was Ishmael, was not part of God's faith plan. So God appears to Abraham again, this time in Genesis 17. And beginning with verse 4, this is what the Bible says. "You will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful." That is, you're going to have an unimaginable number of descendants. "And I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. As for your wife, I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come forth from her. Then in verse 17, the Bible says, then Abram fell on his face and laughed. And the idea is, and he laughed, and he laughed, and he laughed, and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. That is, let Ishmael be my heir. Let Ishmael be the one through whom you are going to keep your promise. But God said, no. But Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. Well, as the story goes, God performed a miracle by opening the womb of a 90-year-old woman and by giving sexual virility to a 100-year-old man. Well, in Genesis 21, this promised son, Isaac, was born. In Hebrews 11:17, Isaac is referred to as Abraham's only begotten son. Now that phrase literally refers to a unique, one-of-a-kind son. Ishmael, Abraham's son by Hagar, was not a unique, one-of-a-kind son. Abraham's son, yes, but Ishmael came about as the result of Abraham and Sarah's human scheming and ingenuity. It came about from their own ability. Isaac, on the other hand, was a son produced by the direct intervention of God. There was no other son like Isaac. And it was this son, the son of a miracle, the son who had been 30 years in coming, the son through whom God's promise of nations and kings had been made, the son on whom Abraham's dreams had rested. It was this son that God was asking Abraham to offer as a sacrifice. This son. Well, the event itself is recorded in Genesis chapter 22. Let's notice what it says. Now, it came about that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. He split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now check out Hebrews 11 again. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. Now let me ask you something. Was Abraham a man who lived by faith? Was Abraham a faith talker, or was he a faith walker? Well, he was a faith walker. He not only said that he lived by faith, in fact, in Genesis 15, we are told that Abraham believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. He said he had faith, but did he? Well, in Genesis 22, we find out. And it is that Old Testament reference that the writer of Hebrews is setting forth here. See, Abraham not only lived by faith, talked about faith, he actually lived by faith. Now, how do we know that? Here's the answer. Because he withheld nothing from God. He trusted God even when God seemed to be taking away everything he had previously promised to give him, in fact, which he had given him. Someone might say, but Abraham believed all along that God would call the whole thing off. Well, I don't think so. The grammatical construction of the words translated offered up in Hebrews 11:17 tell us that in the mind and the heart of Abraham, Isaac was as good as dead. Abraham had already given up his son. The only thing that remained was the act itself. In fact, Genesis 22 gives the sense that Abraham's hand was plunging toward Isaac's body, and his hand had to be restrained by the angel. Now that brings us to the eighth characteristic of living by moving, shaking faith, and this may be the most difficult one yet. Here it is. Living by faith means holding nothing back. Say that phrase with me. Holding nothing back. Hebrews 11 states this idea plainly. He who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac, in this son, your descendants shall be called. And Isaac had not had a child. Moving, shaking faith releases everything in one's possession, even when it seems that doing so is to give up the very thing that God has promised. Moving, shaking faith stands before God with an open palm. Moving, shaking faith is willing to give back instantaneously that which God has already given. Now, how could Abraham take that kind of a posture? Well, Hebrews 11:19 tells us. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead. Abraham's moving, shaking faith held nothing back because his moving, shaking faith, number one, believed that God would find a way, even in the face of impossibility, to fulfill his promises and his purposes through Abraham's life. Moving, shaking faith holds nothing back because moving, shaking faith, number two, never, no, not ever, gives up on the tenacity of God to fulfill all of his promises and all of his purposes, even though everything else says it's not going to happen. You know, in my experience, the greatest faith test always encompass the things that are nearest and dearest to us. Why? Well, if it's not the nearest and dearest, then the test is called into question. Faith tests do not involve trinkets. Faith tests involve treasure. Abraham was not being asked to give up a steak dinner once a week. Abraham was being asked to give up the heart of his heart and to do so for life. Can you imagine? You know, this past week, when that little 2-year-old boy at Disney World in Orlando was suddenly snatched underwater by that alligator, my stomach just turned. I do not know how that impacted you, but it had a profound impact on me. And that father wrestling for the life of that son, but losing to the brute forces of nature. Oh, what gut-wrenching, heart-crushing, emotion-breaking event. But watch this. Abraham was not going to have Isaac suddenly snatched from his control or his presence through brute forces of nature. Abraham was being asked voluntarily to take the life of his son and sacrifice the life of his son, and to do so forever. Folks, I got to tell you, that is more than I can comprehend. God asked for the nearest and dearest thing that Abraham had. May I ask you something? What is it that you hold nearest and dearest to your heart? Just get that in your mind. You don't have to tell me what it is. You don't have to tell your spouse what it is. You don't have to tell your neighbor what it is. You just get into your mind right now the nearest and dearest thing to your heart. Now, let's suppose that God came to you today and said, give it to me. Release it to me. Would you be a faith walker or a faith talker? Would you open your palm or would you squeeze it tight? Have you thought about the fact that when your hand is closed, that hand takes the form of a fist? And when a hand takes the form of a fist, what does it usually mean? It means confrontation. It means a refusal to capitulate. It means that you will fight in order to keep what you see as yours. Maybe for you, it has to do with vocation. God's got something He wants you to do, but your hand is closed. You said, no, God, you cannot have that career. I will not give it to you. It's mine. You can't have it. Will you now open your hand and give it to God? Maybe for you it has to do with some relationship. It's a relationship that is dangerous for you, both physically, spiritually, emotionally, and God is asking you to give it up. But your hand has been closed. You will not give it up. No, Lord, you can't have that relationship. Will you now open your hand and give it to God? Maybe for you it has to do with some point of bitterness or anger. Someone has offended you, maybe even God Himself. Someone has offended you, and down deep there is this necessity to be angry. In fact, the anger has turned to bitterness, and the bitterness has taken hold of your soul, and the bitterness is tearing your soul apart. It has become hatred, and it has become addictive. And God is asking you to give it up, but your hand has been closed. I remember what they did to me. I will not give it up. I will not surrender it. I will not walk away from it. I'm going to hold on to that hatred and anger. And it's killing you too. Will you now open your palm and give it to God? Maybe for you it has something to do with finances. Money means more to you than anything else in this world. And God is saying, open your hand, do it my way. But you are squeezing your hand so tightly that the knuckles are white, thinking that holding on to those dollars is the only way to keep them. And yet Jesus teaches us that the only thing we truly keep is what we are willing to give away. Do you understand that whatever you're holding on to, you are going to lose? Maybe for you it has to do with giving your life to Christ. He is saying to you, I want you to trust my Son who will give you what's best for your life. But you are raising your fist to God, saying, no, Lord, I know what's better for my life than you do. You can't have my life. I mean, after all, who wants to surrender their life to God? Isn't it much better for us to keep our own lives in our own hands? Because we can do so much better than God. And we say, no, Lord, you cannot have my life. I will not give it to you. And yet God is calling you right now to do that very thing. Will you open your hand or will you close it? Will you open your palm right now to God or will you close it? Why not surrender to the Lord right now? Roll it. Roll it. Hello. Roll it, please, ma'am. Do you see that guy on that screen? What activity is he involved in? Tug of war. How well does he look like he's doing? Does he look like he's a man in pain? Does he? Does he look like a man who is on the verge of losing everything? And yet here is a guy who was willing to tear up everything around him in order to hold on to that rope. He made a mess of it. Are you listening? He was going to lose the rope. Everything that you see in his hands was going to be torn out of his hands anyway. Do you understand that? Whatever it is that you are holding on to, you are going to lose. What is it for you? Is this guy a picture of some area of your life, and you are willing to tear up everything around you in order to hold on to what God has said? Release it to me. Did you know that every good thing you have comes from God anyway? It never belonged to you. And when God says, I want that, it's His to start with. And when we will not give God that relationship, or that vocation, or that anger, or those finances, or our very lives, we're going to lose it. God does not tolerate second place. Abraham was willing to give up the very son that would fulfill the promises of God. That's pretty tough, isn't it? Well, so what are we going to do? We just going to keep talking about faith? Are we actually going to start walking faith? We just going to converse well about spirituality? Or will we be men and women who say, Lord, my palms are open. Whatever you ask for, whatever you want, is yours. I give it to you. Can I ask you questions that make you nervous? You sort of say, Connell, I wish you wouldn't talk like that, because I've got some precious things that are near and dear to me. I don't want to give them up. Well, then just prepare to lose. You give it to God. It's His anyway. And you know what He does? He gives it right back. And then He anoints and blesses and multiplies and produces and manufactures all on our behalf. That's hard to believe, Connell. Well, that's why there are not many faith walkers. Because it takes relying on God and putting yourself in the weakest position of vulnerability and say, God, you can have it all. We're not used to coming out from behind our walls of protection and saying, Lord, it's yours. Now, I can tell you this. I don't know what God's going to ask for. I don't know what He is asking for. I don't know where He wants to lead you. But wherever it is, if you want to live a life of power and impact, there's only one way to do that. And that's to open your hands and say, Lord, here are my children. Here are my grandchildren. Here are my relationships. Here's my checkbook. Here's my time. Here's my vocation. Here is my everything. Here is my life. It's yours to build up or destroy. It's yours.